Sergeant Marcus Hartwell had been serving as a Royal Guard for 8 years, but he had never found himself in a situation quite like this one. It was 2:30 a.m. on a cold Tuesday morning in London, and he was walking home from his evening shift. At Buckingham Palace, still wearing his off-duty military uniform, dark trousers, polished boots, and a regulation jacket that clearly identified him as military personnel, Marcus had chosen to walk the 3 miles to his flat instead of taking the Underground, partly for the exercise and partly because he enjoyed the quiet streets of London at night. After spending hours standing at perfect attention, the freedom to move at his own pace through the empty city was one of his favorite ways to unwind. He was taking a shortcut through a residential area in Westminster when he heard the sound that would change his evening completely: a woman's scream, followed by shouting and the sound of running footsteps. Without hesitation, Marcus sprinted toward the commotion. His military training had conditioned him to respond immediately to distress calls, regardless of whether he was officially on duty or not. As he rounded the corner onto Pembroke Street, he could see the scene unfolding in the amber glow of the streetlights. A young woman in her 20s was on the ground beside an overturned handbag, its contents scattered across the pavement. She was pointing down the street and shouting, "He took my phone, he grabbed my purse and knocked me down." Marcus could see a figure in dark clothing running away in the distance, already 2 blocks ahead and moving fast. The woman was clearly shaken but not seriously injured. She was sitting up and seemed more angry than hurt. "Are you all right, miss?" Marcus asked, kneeling beside her to help gather her scattered belongings. "I think so," she replied, accepting his hand to help her. "Stand." He came out of nowhere, grabbed my bag, and when I tried to hold on, he pushed me down hard. My phone was in there, and my wallet, and my house keys. Marcus handed her the items he had collected from the pavement. "Did you get a good look?" "At him? Not really. Medium height, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. He was young, maybe early 20s. God, what am I going to do? My whole life was in that purse." Marcus was about to suggest they call the police when he heard the sound of approaching sirens. Someone else must have heard the commotion and called for help, which was good news. The sooner the authorities were involved, the better chance they had of catching the thief. 2 police cars rounded the corner with their blue lights flashing, though they had turned off their sirens now that they were close to the scene. Marcus felt relieved. Professional help was arriving, and they could take over the situation properly. The first car stopped directly in front of them, and 2 officers got out quickly. Marcus recognized the efficient way they approached the scene. One officer immediately went to check on the victim while the other began assessing the overall situation. "Are you injured, miss?" asked the first officer, a woman in her 30s with sergeant stripes on her uniform. "I'm okay, just shaken up," the victim replied. "This gentleman helped me up and gathered my things. The thief ran that way." Pointed in the direction the attacker had fled, the second officer, a tall man with about 15 years of experience written in the confidence of his bearing, turned his attention to Marcus. "And you are?" "Sergeant Marcus Hartwell, Royal Guard," Marcus replied, automatically providing his rank and unit as he had been trained to do when identifying himself to other law enforcement personnel. But instead of the professional acknowledgement, he expected Marcus saw something change in the officer's expression. The man's eyes narrowed as he took in Marcus's appearance, his military uniform, his proximity to the victim, his presence at the scene. "Royal Guard, eh?" the officer said, and there was something in his tone that Marcus didn't like. "Convenient that you just happened to be here when this happened."
Us.
Marcus felt a chill of concern. "I was walking home from duty when I heard the woman scream. I came to help." The officer looked at his partner, and Marcus saw some kind of silent communication pass between them. The female sergeant was still talking to the victim, but she was also listening to their conversation. "Where exactly were you coming from?" the tall officer asked, pulling out a notebook. "Buckingham Palace. Finished my evening shift about 30 minutes ago." "And you just happened to be walking through this particular neighborhood at 2:30 in the morning?" Marcus was beginning to understand that something was going very wrong with this interaction. "I live about a mile from here. I often walk home." "This way after late shifts?" The officer stepped closer, and Marcus could see suspicion written clearly on his face. "Here's what I'm thinking, Sergeant Hartwell. Young woman gets mugged, her phone and wallet stolen. But when we arrive, we find a man in military uniform who just happens to be at the scene, who just happens to have been helping the victim collect her belongings. The implication hit Marcus like a physical blow. You think I'm the one who attacked her? I think it's awfully convenient that you were here to help right after someone stole her valuables. I think maybe you heard our sirens coming and decided to play the Good Samaritan to throw us off the scent. Marcus looked toward the victim, hoping she would clarify that he had genuinely helped her. But she was still talking to the female officer and seemed unaware of the direction this conversation was taking. Officer, I understand you need to investigate thoroughly, but I assure you, I had nothing to do with this attack. I heard the woman scream and came to help. I've been trying to assist her since I arrived. Tall officer wasn't convinced. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. What? Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. You heard me? Turn around, hands behind your back. You're being detained for questioning in connection with this robbery. Marcus felt his military training warring with his sense of injustice. Every instinct told him to comply with law enforcement, but every fiber of his being knew this was wrong. Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. If you'll just let me explain, ... Turn around now, or we'll turn you around, the officer said, his hand moving toward his handcuffs. Marcus realized that this situation was spiraling completely out of control, and that his cooperation might not be enough to resolve the misunderstanding peacefully. Marcus made the decision to comply, hoping that once the officers had a chance to properly interview the victim and check his identification, the misunderstanding would be cleared up quickly. He turned around and placed his hands behind his back, feeling the cold metal of handcuffs closing around his wrists. Yes. You're being detained on suspicion of robbery, the tall officer announced formally. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned, something which you later rely on in court. As the officer continued with the formal caution, Marcus could hear the victim talking to the female sergeant nearby. I'm telling you, he helped me, the woman was saying, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet night air. When I was on the ground gathering my things, he knelt down and helped me collect everything. He was very kind and respectful. Marcus felt a surge of hope. Surely once the officers heard the victim's account, they would realize they had made a mistake. But the tall officer seemed determined to pursue his theory. Sometimes robbers return to the scene to see if their victims are all right, or to appear helpful when police arrive. It's not uncommon. The female sergeant approached them, looking uncertain. Dave, she's saying, he genuinely helped her. That doesn't mean he wasn't involved, Sarah, the officer replied. He could have been working with the actual thief, or he could have taken her stuff and then pretended to help when he saw us coming. Marcus tried to keep his voice calm and respectful. Officers, I understand you need to be thorough, but I think if you check the timing, you'll find that I couldn't have been the attacker. The victim said the thief ran away, and I was here helping her when you arrived. I couldn't have been in two places at once. Unless you stashed her stuff somewhere and came back, Dave suggested stubbornly. Sarah looked between Marcus and her partner, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the investigation was taking. Dave, maybe we should get some more details. We'll sort out the details at the station, Dave interrupted. Right now, I want to secure the scene and make sure we don't lose any evidence. He turned back to Marcus. What's in your pockets? Wallet, keys, phone, and my military ID, Marcus replied. Dave began searching Marcus's pockets, removing each item and examining them carefully. When he found Marcus's military identification card, he studied it with interest. Sergeant Marcus, Hartwell Grenadier Guards, he read aloud. It says here you're stationed at Wellington Barracks. What were you doing at Buckingham Palace tonight? Royal Guards rotate between different locations, depending on the duty roster, Marcus explained. Tonight, I was on ceremonial duty at the palace. Dave looked at the ID card suspiciously, as if it might be fake. How do we know this is legitimate? Sarah had been growing more uncomfortable with her partner's approach. Dave, that's an official military ID. Why would someone fake being a royal guard? People fake all kinds of things, Dave replied. Besides, even if he is military, that doesn't mean he's not capable of robbery. Marcus was beginning to realize that Dave seemed determined to make him fit the profile of a suspect, regardless of the evidence. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity that could be easily cleared up. This was an officer who had formed a theory, was now looking for facts to support it, rather than following the facts to reach a conclusion. The situation became more complicated when the second police car that had arrived began coordinating with Dave about the search for the actual thief. "We've got units checking the surrounding streets," one of the new officers reported. "No sign of the suspect yet, but we're expanding the search grid." Dave nodded approvingly. "Good. Meanwhile, we'll take this one in for questioning." He was at the scene, and his story doesn't add up. "What about the victim's statement?" Sarah asked pointedly. "She's been very clear that he helped her." "Victims aren't always reliable witnesses," Dave replied dismissively. "They're traumatized, it's dark, and they might not have seen everything that happened." Marcus could see the victim nearby, and she was looking confused and upset by the direction events were taking. She kept glancing toward him with what looked like concern and confusion. "Excuse me," she called out to the officers. I don't understand what's happening." "Why are you arresting the man who helped me? He didn't do anything wrong." Dave turned toward her with what he probably thought was a reassuring expression. "Ma'am, we appreciate your statement, but we need to investigate all possibilities. Sometimes people who seem helpful at crime scenes are actually involved in the crime itself." The woman's eyes widened with disbelief. "But that's ridiculous. He was clearly trying to help me. He was gathering my things from the pavement and asking if I was hurt. The person who attacked me ran away in the opposite direction. You understand?" "Your perspective, ma'am, but we have procedures we need to follow." Marcus watched this exchange with growing frustration. The victim was trying to advocate for him, but Dave seemed determined to ignore any evidence that didn't fit his preconceived theory. "Officers," Marcus said, trying one more time to reason with them, "I suggest you contact my commanding officer at Wellington Barracks. He can verify my identity, my whereabouts this evening, and my character. I've served 8 years without any disciplinary issues." Sarah looked interested in this suggestion, but Dave shook his head. "We're not calling anyone at 3 in the morning based on the word of someone we found at a crime scene." Marcus realized that rational discussion wasn't going to resolve this situation. Dave had decided he was guilty of something, and no amount of evidence or witness testimony was going to change his mind, at least not tonight. As they prepared to transport him to the police station, Marcus began to consider his options. He could continue to cooperate and hope that more senior officers would be more reasonable, or he could take matters into his own hands. The decision was made for him when he heard Dave talking quietly to Sarah about keeping him overnight until we can figure out what really happened. Marcus realized that his 8 years of specialized military training were about to become very relevant to his current situation. As Dave and Sarah prepared to escort him to their patrol car, Marcus's mind shifted into the analytical mode that had been drilled into him during his military training. 8 years as a Royal Guard hadn't just taught him ceremonial duties. It had included extensive training in close protection, escape and evasion, and what the military tactfully called restraint removal techniques. The handcuffs they had used were standard police-issue metal restraints, the kind Marcus had practiced. Escaping from dozens of times during training exercises, the Royal Guard training program included scenarios where guards might be captured or restrained by hostile forces, and learning to escape from various types of restraints was considered an essential skill. Marcus tested the handcuffs subtly as they walked toward the patrol car. They had been applied correctly, but not exceptionally tight. David followed proper procedure, leaving enough space to prevent circulation problems, but not enough for a typical person to slip free. What Dave didn't know was that Marcus wasn't a typical person. During his military training, Marcus had learned that handcuff escape was as much about anatomy and technique as it was about strength. The human hand and wrist could be compressed and manipulated in ways that most people never realized. And with the right knowledge, even properly applied handcuffs could be defeated. But escaping from the handcuffs was only the first part of the problem. Marcus also had to consider what would happen afterward. If he simply broke free and ran, it would confirm Dave's suspicions and make him look guilty of something. If he escaped and then tried to explain, it would appear that he was escalating the situation unnecessarily. However, as he listened to Dave and Sarah discussing their plans for him, Marcus realized that cooperating wasn't going to lead to a quick resolution. Dave seemed committed to his theory, and Marcus could be held for hours or even overnight while they investigated a crime he hadn't committed. "Put him in the back of the car," Dave instructed Sarah. "I want to take another look around the scene before we head to the station." This gave Marcus the opportunity he needed. Once he was in the back of the patrol car with only Sarah nearby, he would have a brief window to act before Dave returned. The key was timing and making sure he didn't escalate the situation beyond what was necessary. Sarah opened the rear door of the patrol car and gestured for Marcus to get in. As he settled into the back seat, she leaned in to check that his seatbelt was properly secured, standard procedure when transporting a detainee. "I'm sorry about this," she said quietly, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was developing. "Dave can be ... overzealous sometimes. If you really are innocent, it will all get sorted out." "I understand you're doing your job," Marcus replied. "But I hope you'll keep an open mind about the possibility that this is a misunderstanding." Sarah nodded and closed the door, then walked over to where Dave was examining the pavement where the attack had occurred. Marcus could see them through the car window, about 20 feet away, with their backs turned to him as they discussed something. Dave was pointing out on the ground. This was his moment. Marcus had practiced the technique so many times that his hands seemed to move on their own. First, he compressed his left hand as much as possible, folding his thumb tightly against his palm and pushing his fingers together. The human hand could become surprisingly narrow when properly compressed, and Marcus had unusually flexible joints. From years of physical training next, he rotated his wrist and hand while applying steady pressure against the handcuff. The metal restraint was designed to prevent pulling straight back, but it wasn't as effective against the twisting, compressing motion that Marcus was applying. It took exactly 12 seconds for his left hand to slip free of the handcuff. Once one hand was free, removing the other cuff was simply a matter of using the key technique he had learned. Most handcuffs could be opened with improvised tools. If you knew the right pressure points and angles, Marcus used the metal buckle from his military belt, which had been designed with exactly this kind of emergency use in mind. 3 seconds later, both handcuffs were lying on the seat beside him. He was completely free. But instead of immediately leaving the car, Marcus sat still and considered his options. He could escape and disappear into the night, but that would make him look guilty and would probably result in a manhunt. He could escape and try to find the real thief. But he had no idea where to look and would be operating without any official authority. Or he could do something that would prove his innocence while demonstrating that Dave had seriously underestimated who he was dealing with. Marcus made his decision. He quietly opened the car door and stepped out, keeping low and using the vehicle to shield his movements from the 2 officers who were still examining the crime scene. His military training had taught him how to move silently and stay unobserved, skills that were serving him well in this urban environment. He could hear Dave and Sarah discussing their theory about what had happened during the robbery. Dave was still insisting that Marcus's presence at the scene was suspicious, while Sarah was pointing out inconsistencies in that theory. "I'm telling you, something doesn't add up," Sarah was saying. The victim was very clear that he helped her. Why would a robber do that? "Maybe he panicked when he heard our sirens," Dave replied. "Maybe he thought playing the hero would throw us off his trail." Marcus smiled grimly as he listened to this conversation. In about 30 seconds, Dave was going to discover just how badly he had misjudged the situation. Marcus moved silently to a position where he could observe both officers without being seen. Then, using a technique he had learned for voice projection without shouting, he spoke just loudly enough for them to hear him clearly. "Officers, if you'd like to continue our conversation, you might want to turn around." Both Dave and Sarah spun around immediately, their hands instinctively moving toward their equipment. When they saw Marcus standing calmly beside their patrol car, completely free of the handcuffs that had been securing him just moments before, their expressions were priceless. Marcus held up the handcuffs, dangling them from one finger. "I believe these belong to you." The silence that followed Marcus's words stretched for several seconds as Dave and Sarah tried to process what they were seeing. Marcus stood calmly beside their patrol car, holding the handcuffs that had been securing him moments before, showing no sign of aggression or intent to flee. "How the hell did you, double quotes," Dave started, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. "Specialized training," Marcus replied simply. "Part of Royal Guard preparation includes escape and evasion techniques. We're taught to free ourselves from various types of restraints in case we're ever captured while protecting members of the royal family." Sarah was staring at him with a mixture of amazement and professional interest. "You escaped from police. Handcuffs in less than 15 seconds? 12 seconds for the first cuff, 3 seconds for the second," Marcus corrected. "But that's not the point I'm trying to make here." Dave had recovered from his initial shock and was now looking angry and suspicious again. "The point you're making is that you're resisting arrest and demonstrating that you're dangerous." "Actually," Marcus said, placing the handcuffs gently on the hood of the patrol car, "the point I'm making is that if I were guilty of robbery, I would be about 3 blocks away by now instead of standing here trying to have a rational conversation. With you, this observation seemed to penetrate even Dave's determination to see Marcus as a suspect." Sarah was nodding slowly, clearly beginning to understand the implications of what had just happened. "Think about it logically," Marcus continued. "I've just demonstrated that I can escape from restraints and move without being detected. If I had committed a crime, why would I stick around to help the victim? Why would I still be here when you arrived? And why would I escape from your handcuffs only to immediately give them back to you?" Sarah looked at her partner. "Dave, he has a point. If he were guilty, this would have been the perfect opportunity to disappear." Dave was clearly struggling with having his assumptions challenged so dramatically. Maybe he's just trying to confuse us. Maybe this is some kind of psychological game. Marcus could see that Dave was so invested in his theory that he was having trouble accepting evidence that contradicted it. This was a problem Marcus had encountered before in various contexts. People who became so attached to their initial assessment that they couldn't adapt when presented with new information. "Officer." Marcus paused, realizing he didn't know Dave's name. "Constable Williams," Dave replied somewhat grudgingly. "Constable Williams, I understand that you're trying to do your job thoroughly, and I respect that. But I think we need to step back and look at this situation objectively." Marcus gestured toward the victim, who was still standing nearby and had been watching the entire exchange with fascination and growing concern. "The victim has consistently stated that I helped her after she was attacked. The timing doesn't work for me to have been the attacker. I've made no attempt to flee, despite having both the ability and the opportunity to do so. And I'm offering to provide you with contacts who can verify my identity, my whereabouts earlier this evening, and my character." Sarah was clearly convinced. But Dave was still resistant. All of that could be part of an elaborate deception. "Constable Williams," Marcus said, his patience finally showing signs of strain. "With respect, what you're suggesting would require me to be simultaneously sophisticated enough to plan and execute a complex deception involving fake military credentials and specialized escape training, while also being stupid enough to hang around a crime scene waiting to be arrested." The victim had been listening to this entire conversation, and she finally decided to intervene directly. "Excuse me," she said, walking over to the 3 of them. "I'm sorry, but I can't listen to this anymore. Officer, this man is not the person who attacked me. I know the difference between someone who helps me and someone who hurts me." She turned to Marcus. "I don't know what kind of training you have or how you got out of those handcuffs, but I want you to know that I'm grateful for your help tonight. Without you, I would have been lying on that pavement much longer, probably crying and alone." She turned back to Dave with a firmness that surprised everyone. "And officer, I understand you're trying to protect me, but you're wasting time that could be spent looking for the person who actually robbed me while you're harassing the person who helped me." Dave looked uncomfortable being challenged so directly by the victim he was supposed to be helping. Sarah seized the opportunity to take control of the situation. "You know what?" Sarah said decisively. I think we need to reset this entire investigation, Mr. Hartwell. Would you be willing to come to the station voluntarily to provide a statement and help us establish a timeline of events? Absolutely, Marcus replied immediately. I want to do everything I can to help catch the real thief. And would you be willing to provide contacts for verification of your identity and whereabouts this evening? My commanding officer, the duty sergeant from tonight's shift, and several colleagues who saw me leave the palace, Marcus confirmed. Sarah nodded approvingly. Good. That's what we should have started with instead of jumping to conclusions. Looked pointedly at Dave. Dave, I think we owe Mr. Hartwell an apology for the way this has been handled. Dave still looked reluctant, but he was beginning to realize that his approach had been problematic from the beginning. If I was ... overly hasty in my assessment, I apologize. Marcus could hear the grudging nature of the apology, but he chose to accept it graciously. No apology necessary, Constable Williams. You were trying to protect a crime victim, and I respect that motivation, even if I disagreed with your methods. The victim looked relieved that the situation was finally moving in a more productive direction. So what happens now? Are you going? To look for the person who actually stole my things? Sarah turned her attention back to the primary investigation. Yes, ma'am. We have officers searching the area. And now that we've clarified Mr. Hartwell's role in this situation, we can focus on getting a better description of the actual suspect and pursuing more productive leads. As they walked back toward the patrol cars, Marcus reflected on how quickly the entire situation had escalated and then been resolved. His decision to escape from the handcuffs had been risky, but it had ultimately demonstrated his innocence more effectively than any amount of arguing would have accomplished. Mr. Hartwell, Sarah said as they reached the vehicles, I have to ask how many people could do what you just did with those handcuffs. Marcus smiled. In the general population, very few. In the Royal Guard, it's considered a basic skill that everyone needs to master. Dave, who had been quiet during the walk back to the cars, finally spoke up. I've been a police officer for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone escape from handcuffs that quickly. Most people don't have a reason to learn how, Marcus replied. But when your job involves protecting members of the royal family, you need to be prepared for situations where normal rules don't apply. At the police station, the atmosphere was completely different from what Marcus had expected when he first heard Dave mention taking him in for questioning. Instead of being processed as a suspect, he found himself being treated as a valuable witness who could help solve the actual crime. Detective Inspector Patricia Moore, who had been called in to oversee the investigation, listened to Marcus's account with the kind of professional attention that Dave should have shown from the beginning. So you were walking home from your shift at Buckingham Palace when you heard the victim scream, she summarized after taking his detailed statement. You responded immediately, helped the victim collect her scattered belongings. We're still assisting her when our officers arrived on scene. That's correct, Marcus confirmed. I never saw the actual attacker except as a distant figure running away. D.I. Moore nodded and made notes in her file. Your commanding officer has confirmed your identity and verified that you were on duty until 2:15 a.m. tonight. The palace security cameras show you leaving through the staff exit at 2:18 a.m., which supports your timeline perfectly. She looked up at Marcus with professional respect. I understand there was some confusion about your role in this incident when you were first contacted by our officers. Marcus chose his words carefully, not wanting to create problems for Dave. Despite the way he had been treated, Constable Williams was being thorough in his investigation. When unusual circumstances arise, it's natural for officers to consider all possibilities. D.I. Moore's expression suggested she understood exactly what had happened. She appreciated Marcus's diplomatic response. Yes, well, I understand you also demonstrated some unusual capabilities during your interaction with Constables Williams and Parker. I use training that's standard for Royal Guard personnel, Marcus replied. In hindsight, I probably should have mentioned my specialized training when I was first detained. It might have avoided some confusion. The ability to escape from police restraints in 15 seconds is not something we encounter very often. D.I. Moore observed with what might have been amusement. I'm curious about the extent of this training, Marcus. considered how much detail to share about Royal Guard training procedures. We're prepared for situations where we might need to protect members of the royal family under adverse conditions. Include scenarios where we might be captured, restrained, or separated from our equipment. And this training is effective. Enough that you could defeat standard police handcuffs without tools or assistance? The techniques work on most commercially available restraints. Yes. But the training also emphasizes using these skills only when absolutely necessary and in ways that don't escalate dangerous situations. D.I. Moore made more notes, clearly fascinated by this glimpse into specialized military training that most police officers never encountered. Well, Mr. Hartwell, your cooperation has been extremely valuable, and I want to thank you for your assistance tonight, both in helping the victim initially and in providing such a detailed statement. She paused and looked at him thoughtfully. I also want to apologize for the way you were treated initially. Constable Williams has been reminded about the importance of thorough investigation before making assumptions about suspects. Marcus nodded graciously. I understand the pressures police officers face, especially when responding to crimes in progress. No hard feelings. There is one more thing, D. Moore continued. The victim has specifically requested to speak with you before you leave tonight. She wanted to thank you personally and ask about your background. Would you be willing to meet with her briefly? Of course, Marcus replied. I'd be happy to speak with her. A few minutes later, Marcus found himself in a small conference room with the robbery victim, whose name he learned was Emily Richardson. She was a graduate student at King's College London who had been walking home from the library when she was attacked. I wanted to thank you properly, Emily said as soon as they sat down. Not just for helping me collect my things, but for the way you handled that whole situation with the police officers. You don't need to thank me, Marcus replied. Anyone would have done the same thing. Emily shook her head firmly. No, they wouldn't have. Most people would have walked away when the police started treating you like a suspect. You could have just disappeared and saved yourself a lot of trouble. Running away would have made me look guilty, Marcus pointed out. Maybe, but you also could have gotten angry and made the situation worse. Instead, you stayed calm and helped everyone figure out what actually happened. Emily paused, studying his face. That police officer said you're a Royal Guard? Is that really what you do? Marcus nodded. I've been serving for 8 years. It's been an honor and a privilege. What's it like? Emily asked, her curiosity evident. I mean, what do you actually do day to day? Marcus found himself describing aspects of his work that he rarely discussed with civilians. He talked about the ceremonial duties that most people saw, but also about the extensive training, the responsibility of protecting important people, and the pride that came from being part of something larger than himself. The part that most people don't understand, Marcus explained, that the ceremonial aspects are just the visible part of what we do. The real job is being prepared for anything that might threaten the people we're sworn to protect. Listened with fascination. Like being able to escape from handcuffs in 15 seconds? Marcus smiled. That's just one small skill among many. The important thing is being ready to do whatever the situation requires. Well, Emily said, I'm certainly glad you were ready to help me tonight. I was so scared and confused after being knocked down, and having someone there who was calm and competent made all the difference. She hesitated for a moment, then continued. Can I ask you something personal? Of course. And that police officer was treating you like a suspect, accusing you of being the person who attacked me. Weren't you angry? I would have been furious. Marcus considered her question carefully. I was frustrated by the injustice of the situation, but getting angry wouldn't have helped solve the problem. Military training teaches you to focus on objectives rather than emotions. But you did escape from those handcuffs, Emily pointed out. That wasn't exactly passive acceptance of the situation. Marcus smiled. No, it wasn't. Sometimes you have to take action to resolve a problem, but you can do that without letting anger control your decisions. Emily nodded thoughtfully. I think I understand. You stayed in control of yourself even when the situation was out of control. Exactly. And in the end, everything worked out the way it should have. Out. D.I. Moore knocked on the conference room door and entered with an update. Mr. Hartwell, Miss Richardson, I have some good news. We've apprehended a suspect in the robbery case. Both Marcus and Emily looked up with interest. A man matching the description provided by Miss Richardson was spotted by one of our patrol units, about 6 blocks from the original scene, D. Moore continued. When officers approached him, he attempted to flee, but he was carrying items that appeared to belong to Miss Richardson. Emily's eyes lit up with relief and excitement. You found my things? We believe so. The suspect had a phone and wallet that match your description, along with several other items that suggest he may be responsible for multiple robberies in this area over the past few weeks. Marcus felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that the real criminal had been caught and that Emily would get her belongings back. But more than that, he was pleased that the investigation had been handled properly once D. Moore had taken charge. Will, I need to identify him? Emily asked. We'll need you to come in tomorrow to formally identify your property and provide a statement for the court case, D. Moore replied. But the physical evidence is quite strong, and he's already admitted to being in the area tonight. She turned to Marcus. Mr. Hartwell, your assistance has been invaluable in this case. Not only did you help the victim immediately after the attack, but your cooperation with our investigation helped us refocus on finding the real perpetrator instead of wasting time on false leads. Marcus appreciated the professional recognition, but he was more interested in the outcome for Emily. I'm just glad Miss Richardson will get her belongings back and that the person responsible will face justice. As they prepared to leave the station, Emily walked with Marcus toward the exit. I know I keep thanking you, she said, but I want you to know that this evening could have been much worse for me if you hadn't been there. Not just because you helped me physically, but because you showed me what it looks like when someone chooses to do the right thing, even when it's difficult. Marcus was touched by her words. Miss Richardson, you showed courage tonight, too. When the police were treating me as a suspect, you spoke up for me even though you barely knew me. That took character. I just told the truth, Emily replied. Sometimes. That's the hardest thing to do, Marcus observed, especially when authority figures are suggesting a different version of events. They reached the exit of the police station, and Emily hesitated for a moment. Can I ask you one more question? She said. Of course. That thing you did with the handcuffs escaping in 15 seconds? How many people could actually do that? Marcus smiled. Among civilians? Very few. It requires specific training and a lot of practice. But among Royal Guard personnel, it's considered a basic skill. And you learn this as part of your regular training? We learn many skills that we hope we'll never need to use, Marcus replied. Tonight was actually the first time I've ever used restraint escape techniques in a real situation. Emily looked amazed. Really? Your first time? The Tory training is designed to be effective even under stress and in unfamiliar situations. But yes, tonight was the first time I've ever escaped from police handcuffs while being wrongly accused of a crime I didn't commit. They both laughed at the absurdity of the situation. Marcus realized that despite the stress and confusion of the evening, everything had ultimately worked out well. Well, Emily said as they prepared to part ways, I hope your walk home is much less eventful than your walk was supposed to be tonight. I think I'll take the underground, Marcus replied with a smile. I've had enough adventure for one evening. As Emily got into a taxi that D. Moore had arranged to take her home safely, she rolled down the window for one final comment. Cue again, Sergeant Hartwell. And if you ever need a character witness, you know where to find me. Marcus waved. Goodbye, and began walking toward the nearest underground station, reflecting on one of the most unusual evenings of his military career. It set out for a simple walk home, and it ended up demonstrating specialized training skills, helping solve a robbery case and making a new friend. Most importantly, he had learned something about the importance of staying calm under pressure and trusting that truth, and justice would ultimately prevail. Even when the initial circumstances seemed to be working against him. 3 weeks later, Marcus found himself in an unexpected meeting at New Scotland Yard. D. Moore had requested to speak with him about the incident, and he had assumed it would be a routine follow-up interview about the court case against Emily's attacker. Instead, he walked into a conference room filled with senior police officers, training instructors, and what appeared to be several military liaisons. Sergeant Hartwell, D. Moore, greeted him as he entered. Thank you for coming. I hope you don't mind. But your experience 3 weeks ago has generated quite a bit of interest in various circles. Marcus took a seat at the large conference table, wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into. The incident with Constables Williams and Parker has been thoroughly reviewed. Moore continued, and while we've addressed the procedural issues that led to the initial misunderstanding, your response to the situation has raised some interesting questions about police training and preparedness. A senior officer, whom Marcus didn't recognize, spoke up. Sergeant Hartwell, I'm Chief Superintendent Roberts. I understand you were able to escape from police restraints in approximately 15 seconds, using techniques that are standard training. For Royal Guard personnel, that's correct, sir, Marcus replied, wondering where this conversation was heading. And you did this without tools, without assistance, and in a way that didn't damage the equipment or escalate the confrontation. The techniques are designed to be non-destructive and de-escalating, Marcus confirmed. The goal is to resolve dangerous situations, not create new problems. Chief Superintendent Roberts exchanged glances with the other officials around the table. Sergeant Hartwell, we're wondering if you would be willing to help us develop improved training protocols for police officers who might encounter individuals with similar capabilities. Marcus was surprised by the request. I'm not sure I understand, sir. Moore stepped in to explain. What we've realized is that police officers are increasingly likely to encounter people with specialized military or security training veterans. Current military personnel, private security contractors, and others who have skills that go beyond what civilian police training typically addresses. The incident with Constables Williams and Parker highlighted some significant gaps in our preparedness, added another officer. If you hadn't chosen to cooperate and de-escalate, that situation could have become much more serious. Chief Superintendent Roberts nodded. We're proposing a joint training program between the Metropolitan Police and military security specialists. Officers would learn to recognize when they're dealing with someone who has advanced training, how to communicate effectively in those situations, and what to expect in terms of capabilities. Marcus was intrigued by the concept. You'd like me to help develop this training? We'd like you to help us understand what skills are common among military personnel, what motivates people with your background, and how police officers can work more effectively with, rather than against, individuals who have specialized training. A military liaison officer who had been quiet during the discussion finally spoke up. Sergeant Hartwell. This program could also benefit military personnel who'd find themselves in civilian law enforcement situations. Better understanding of police procedures and expectations could prevent future misunderstandings. Marcus realized this was a significant opportunity to contribute to improved cooperation between military and civilian law enforcement. I'd be honored to help with this program, but I'd need approval from my commanding officer and assurance that it wouldn't interfere with my regular duties. Already arranged, Chief Superintendent Roberts replied with a smile. Your commanding officer is very supportive of the program and sees it as valuable community outreach for the Royal Guard. Over the following hour, Marcus found himself in detailed discussions about training scenarios, communication techniques, and the psychological factors that influenced how trained individuals responded to detention and questioning. The key insight from your experience, Moore observed, is that someone with advanced training will evaluate a situation differently than a typical civilian. They'll assess escape opportunities, threat levels, and strategic options that wouldn't occur to most people, but they're also more likely to understand the importance of de-escalation and lawful cooperation, Marcus added. Military training emphasizes discipline and respect for legitimate authority, which is why communication and mutual understanding are so crucial, agreed Chief Superintendent Roberts. If Constable Williams had approached you as a trained professional, rather than a typical suspect, the entire situation would have been handled differently. As the meeting concluded, Marcus felt a sense of satisfaction that something positive had come from what had initially been a very negative experience. His 15-second escape from police, a toss, had led to the development of training that could improve law enforcement interactions with military personnel throughout the country. 6 months later, Marcus found himself regularly conducting training sessions for police officers from various departments. He taught them to recognize signs of military training, understand the mindset of individuals with specialized skills, and communicate effectively in situations that involve trained personnel. But perhaps more importantly, he taught them about the experience of being wrongly suspected and how the approach taken by investigating officers could either escalate or de-escalate tense situations. The goal, Marcus would tell each group of officers, is not to be intimidated by someone's training or capabilities, but to understand that those same capabilities can be assets to your investigation. If you approach the situation with respect and professionalism. He often ended his presentations with the story of Emily Richardson and how her courage in speaking up for him had been just as important as his specialized training in resolving the situation. Sometimes the most important skill isn't knowing how to escape from handcuffs, he would conclude. Sometimes it's knowing when not to escape, when to cooperate, and how to work with others to find the truth. The program became so successful that it was eventually adopted by police departments throughout the UK, and Marcus received a commendation for his contribution to improving police-military relations. But when people asked him about the incident that had started it all, the night he escaped from police handcuffs in 15 seconds flat, Marcus always focused on the larger lesson. The real story isn't about the escape, he would say, what happened after the escape. It's about choosing cooperation over confrontation, truth over convenience, and justice over personal vindication. Emily Richardson, who had become a friend and eventually a police liaison herself, often attended Marcus's training sessions as a guest speaker. She would tell officers about experiencing both sides of the situation, being a crime victim who needed protection, and being a witness who had to advocate for someone being wrongly accused. What Sergeant Hartwell taught me, she would conclude her presentations, is that real strength isn't about what you can do when you're in control. It's about what you choose to do when everything is out of control. And in the end, that lesson proved to be far more valuable than any escape technique could ever be.